Hello and welcome to Nap to History, a quiet space where we slow down and let the past unfold, one soft story at a time. Tonight, we'll gently wander through the shocking truth about ancient Egyptian mummies, not to memorize names or dates, but to feel the echoes of lives once lived. Whether you're lying down for the night or just taking a moment to breathe, I'm really glad you're here. If you find comfort in calm, thoughtful history, feel free to subscribe. There's always another peaceful chapter waiting. Before we dive into the startling realities of mummification that have remained hidden from the general public for so long, let's take a moment to set the stage. Ancient Egypt, that magnificent civilization that flourished along the Nile River for over 3 millennia, has captivated our imaginations since the first Western explorers began uncovering its secrets in the 18th and 19th centuries. The popular image of Egypt conjures up visions of golden pharaohs, towering pyramids, and mysterious mummies wrapped in pristine linen bandages. But the reality of ancient Egyptian mummification was far more complex, brutal, and frankly disturbing than most people realize. The process of mummification that we're familiar with from movies and museum displays represents only a small fraction of the full picture. What you're about to discover tonight will fundamentally change how you think about ancient Egyptian burial practices, their religious beliefs, and the true extent to which they went to preserve the dead. Some of these revelations may be difficult to hear, but they paint a far more authentic portrait of a civilization that was simultaneously sophisticated and savage, deeply spiritual and ruthlessly practical. The ancient Egyptians believed that death was merely a transition to another form of existence, and that the physical body needed to be preserved in order for the soul to successfully navigate the afterlife. This belief system, which developed over thousands of years, led to increasingly elaborate and shocking methods of preservation that varied dramatically depending on one's social status, wealth, and the specific time period in which they lived. The story begins in the pre-dynastic period, around 3500 BCE, when the earliest inhabitants of the Nile Valley first began to notice something remarkable about their desert burials. Bodies interred in the hot, dry sand of the Egyptian desert naturally underwent a process of desiccation that preserved the skin, hair, and facial features in an almost lifelike state. These naturally mummified remains, which archaeologists call sand mummies, were likely the inspiration for the elaborate artificial mummification processes that would follow. Our journey tonight will take us through the hidden chambers of ancient embalmers' workshops, into the tombs of forgotten pharaohs, and alongside modern archaeologists who have uncovered evidence that challenges everything we thought we knew about mummification. We'll explore the disturbing practices that were considered normal and necessary, the economic realities that drove the mummification industry, and the shocking discoveries that continue to emerge from Egyptian sands even today. The earliest attempts at artificial mummification were crude and often unsuccessful. Bodies were wrapped in linen and covered in resin, but without proper removal of internal organs, decay would inevitably set in. It wasn't until the Old Kingdom period, around 2600 BCE, that the Egyptians began to develop the shocking techniques that would become the hallmark of their mummification practices. The first truly disturbing aspect of Egyptian mummification that most people don't realize is the sheer brutality of the process. Far from the gentle, reverent procedure often depicted in popular media, mummification was a violent and invasive operation that bore more resemblance to a butcher's work than a religious ceremony. The embalmers, known as Wabet priests, were skilled craftsmen who approached their work with the detached efficiency of surgeons, but their methods would horrify modern sensibilities. But what started as a natural phenomenon observed by ancient peoples would evolve into something far more sinister and systematic. The Egyptians, being keen observers of natural processes and deeply religious people, began to see the hand of the gods in this preservation. They believed that the gods intended for the body to be preserved, and that they could improve upon nature's work through their own intervention. The process began with the removal of the brain, a procedure that was both shocking in its brutality and remarkable in its ingenuity. Using a long, thin rod inserted through the nostril, the embalmer would break through the ethmoid bone at the base of the skull and essentially scramble the brain tissue until it could be drained out through the nose. This process, known as excerebration, was often incomplete, leaving fragments of brain tissue that would putrefy and cause the mummy to emit foul odors for years after burial. The removed organs weren't simply discarded, however. They were carefully cleaned, dried, and treated with natron salt and aromatic resins before being wrapped individually and placed in special containers called canopic jars. Each jar was protected by one of the 4 sons of Horus. Imseti guarded the liver, Duamutef protected the stomach, Hapi watched over the lungs, and Kebisnuif safeguarded the intestines. But the brain removal was just the beginning. What followed was even more disturbing. The embalmers would make a long incision along the left side of the abdomen, typically about 4 inches long, and reach inside to remove all of the internal organs, except for the heart, which they believed was the seat of intelligence and emotion. The process of evisceration required the embalmer to literally reach inside the body cavity and tear out the lungs, liver, stomach, and intestines by hand. The empty body cavity was then thoroughly cleaned and stuffed with a mixture of natron salt, sawdust, linen, and aromatic spices. The incision was sewn shut or covered with a plate, often made of gold for wealthy individuals. But perhaps the most shocking aspect of this process was how routine it became for the embalmers. These were not reverent priests performing sacred rituals, but skilled workers who processed dozens of bodies each month with assembly line efficiency. The social realities of mummification reveal another shocking truth that challenges our romanticized view of ancient Egypt. The elaborate mummification we associate with pharaohs and nobles was available only to the wealthy elite. The vast majority of Egyptians, the farmers, laborers and artisans who made up perhaps 95% of the population, could never afford such treatment. For these common people, mummification was either a crude, bargain basement procedure or was simply unavailable altogether. Herodotus, the ancient Greek historian who visited Egypt in the 5th century BCE, described 3 different levels of mummification available to Egyptian customers, like packages at a modern funeral home. The most expensive treatment, reserved for pharaohs and the super-wealthy, took 70 days and included all the elaborate procedures we've described. The middle-tier treatment skipped the brain removal and simply injected the body cavity with cedar oil to dissolve the internal organs, which were then drained out. The cheapest option involved little more than a thorough washing and brief treatment with natron salt. But even more shocking is what happened to those who couldn't afford any level of mummification. Archaeological evidence suggests that the bodies of the poor were often simply thrown into mass graves or left to decay in the desert. Some were wrapped in a few strips of linen and buried in shallow graves that were frequently disturbed by wild animals. The contrast between the golden splendor of royal tombs and the grim reality of commoner burials reveals the extreme inequality that characterized ancient Egyptian society. This economic stratification of death had profound religious implications that most people don't realize. The Egyptians believed that proper mummification was essential for achieving immortality in the afterlife. This meant that the poor were effectively excluded from eternal life by their economic status, creating a theological system in which the gods apparently favored the wealthy. This shocking reality contradicts the common perception of ancient Egypt as a civilization with a unified egalitarian approach to death and the afterlife. The mummification industry itself was a complex and often ruthless business that employed thousands of people across Egypt. Embalmers' workshops were established near major cities and religious centers, and they competed fiercely for customers. Some workshops specialized in high-end mummification for the elite, while others focused on volume processing of middle-class clients. The most shocking aspect of this industry was how commercialized it became, with embalmers using aggressive sales tactics and even offering payment plans to attract customers. Evidence suggests that some unscrupulous embalmers would deliberately damage bodies during the mummification process in order to upsell clients to more expensive treatments. Others would substitute cheaper materials for the expensive resins and spices they claimed to be using, or would reuse bandages and wrappings from previous clients. The level of fraud and corruption in the mummification industry would have made it familiar to any modern consumer dealing with unethical businesses. Perhaps most shocking of all was the treatment of female mummies, particularly those of young women. Ancient sources suggest that the embalmers often sexually abused female corpses, particularly those of attractive young women. To prevent this, families would sometimes deliberately delay bringing women's bodies to the embalmers until decomposition had begun, making them less appealing to potential abusers. This horrifying reality reveals the dark underbelly of what was supposed to be a sacred religious practice. The religious aspects of mummification also contain shocking elements that challenge our understanding of ancient Egyptian spirituality. While we often think of mummification as a gentle, reverent process guided by profound religious beliefs, the reality was far more pragmatic and sometimes brutal. The embalmers performed their work not as sacred priests, but as skilled craftsmen who were actually considered ritually unclean by Egyptian society. The Wabet priests, who performed mummifications, were required to live apart from the general population and undergo purification rituals before and after their work. They were forbidden from entering temples or participating in many religious ceremonies because their contact with dead bodies made them spiritually contaminated. This reveals a shocking contradiction in Egyptian religion. The very people responsible for ensuring eternal life for the dead were themselves considered religiously polluted. Archaeological evidence has revealed that embalmers sometimes made serious mistakes that resulted in badly damaged mummies. Some bodies show evidence of being accidentally decapitated during the mummification process, while others were so poorly preserved that they began decomposing even before burial. In these cases, embalmers would sometimes attempt cover-ups, using padding and bandages to hide missing limbs or damaged areas. The process of mummification also involved practices that would be considered sacrilegious by modern standards. Embalmers routinely broke bones, crushed skulls, and dismembered bodies in order to achieve better preservation. They showed no hesitation in cutting, tearing, and manipulating corpses in ways that demonstrated a remarkably matter-of-fact attitude toward death and the human body. Modern scientific analysis of mummies has revealed shocking details about the health and living conditions of ancient Egyptians that challenge our perception of this advanced civilization. CT scans and other imaging technologies have shown that many mummies suffered from severe malnutrition, parasitic infections, and dental disease. Even pharaohs and nobles, who had access to the best food and medical care available, often suffered from ailments that would be easily preventable today. King Tutankhamun, perhaps the most famous Egyptian mummy, has been the subject of extensive scientific study that has revealed shocking details about his life and death. CT scans show that the young pharaoh suffered from multiple genetic disorders, likely the result of inbreeding among the royal family. He had a cleft palate, a curved spine, and a deformed foot that would have made walking difficult. Most shockingly, evidence suggests that he may have died from complications related to a broken leg, possibly sustained in a chariot accident. The wrapping process itself, which most people imagine as a careful, ritualistic procedure, was often hurried and sloppy. Many mummies have been found with bandages applied randomly, with little attention to aesthetics or proper preservation. Some mummies were wrapped with their arms and legs in unnatural positions, suggesting that the embalmers were more concerned with speed than with dignity. The mummy of Tutankhamun also reveals the shocking incompetence of his embalmers. The mummification was so poorly done that much of the body was severely damaged. The embalmers appear to have made numerous mistakes, including accidentally setting the body on fire during the wrapping process. The resulting damage was so extensive that when Howard Carter unwrapped the mummy in 1925, it literally fell apart in his hands. Recent discoveries have revealed even more shocking truths about Egyptian mummification practices. In 2014, archaeologists discovered a mass mummification site near Cairo that contained over 8,000 mummified crocodiles. This discovery revealed that the Egyptians were mummifying animals on an industrial scale, far beyond what was previously imagined. The crocodiles were poorly preserved and carelessly wrapped, suggesting that animal mummification had become a commercial enterprise rather than a religious practice. But Tutankhamun's case is not unique. Many royal mummies show evidence of poor mummification techniques, suggesting that even the most expensive treatments were often inadequate. The mummy of Amenhotep II, for example, was found with his brain still intact, despite the fact that brain removal was standard practice for royal mummifications. The mummy of Thutmose IV was so poorly preserved that most of the body had deteriorated by the time it was discovered. The animal mummification industry appears to have been even more corrupt than human mummification. X-ray analysis of animal mummies has revealed that many contain no animal remains at all, but are instead stuffed with mud, sticks, and random debris. Customers were paying for mummified animals to offer to the gods, but were often receiving worthless fakes. This widespread fraud suggests that the entire mummification industry had become thoroughly commercialized and corrupt by the later periods of Egyptian history. The discovery of fake animal mummies has led researchers to re-examine human mummies with similar techniques, and the results have been equally shocking. Some human mummies have been found to contain multiple bodies or partial remains from different individuals. Others appear to have been deliberately constructed from random body parts, possibly to create mummies when intact corpses were not available. Perhaps most disturbing of all are the discoveries that suggest some mummies may have been created from people who were still alive. Archaeological evidence from some sites suggests that living people may have been subjected to mummification procedures as part of religious rituals or punishment. While this evidence is still being studied and debated, the possibility that some mummies were victims of live burial or ritual sacrifice adds a horrifying dimension to our understanding of ancient Egyptian practices. Some pharaohs used mummification as a form of propaganda, commissioning elaborate tombs and mummification procedures that were designed to impress their subjects and intimidate their enemies. The discovery of multiple burial sites for single pharaohs suggests that some rulers may have prepared several mummies of themselves, possibly to confuse tomb robbers or to ensure that at least one would survive intact. The political aspects of mummification also reveal shocking truths about ancient Egyptian society. Mummification was not just about religion or the afterlife. It was also a powerful tool of political control. The elaborate mummification of pharaohs served to reinforce their divine status and justify their absolute power over their subjects. The fact that only the wealthy could afford proper mummification helped maintain class distinctions even in death. The mummification of pharaohs also involved shocking acts of political manipulation. When pharaohs died under suspicious circumstances, their successors sometimes ordered their bodies to be mummified in ways that would hide evidence of foul play. Some royal mummies show evidence of having been damaged after death, and then carefully concealed during the mummification process. Modern analysis of these royal mummies has revealed evidence of systematic looting and desecration. Many show signs of having been unwrapped and re-wrapped multiple times, presumably as successive generations of priests and officials helped themselves to the valuable amulets and jewelry buried with the pharaohs. This evidence suggests that corruption and grave robbing were endemic problems even among those charged with protecting the royal dead. The cache of royal mummies discovered in the Valley of the Kings reveals another shocking truth about ancient Egyptian politics. Many of these mummies had been removed from their original tombs and reburied together in a secret location, apparently to protect them from tomb robbers. But the condition of these mummies suggests that they had already been stripped of their valuable burial goods, possibly by the very priests who were supposed to be protecting them. The international trade in mummies during the medieval and early modern periods reveals another shocking chapter in the story of Egyptian mummification. For centuries, mummies were exported from Egypt and sold in European markets for use as medicine. Ground-up mummy was believed to have miraculous healing properties and was prescribed for everything from headaches to plague. This grotesque trade reached its peak during the Renaissance, when mummy powder was more valuable than gold in European apothecaries. The Victorian era brought new forms of exploitation and sensationalism surrounding Egyptian mummies. Public mummy unwrapping events became popular entertainment, with wealthy collectors hosting parties where guests could watch as ancient Egyptian remains were systematically destroyed in the name of science and spectacle. These events were often more about sensationalism than serious research, and resulted in the loss of valuable archaeological information. The demand for mummies was so great that suppliers began creating fake mummies from recently deceased individuals, often executed criminals or plague victims. These were treated with bitumen and other preservatives to give them the appearance of ancient Egyptian mummies, then sold to unsuspecting customers in Europe. The scale of this fraud was enormous, with thousands of fake mummies being produced and exported during the 16th and 17th centuries. Even more shocking is the fact that some European physicians and scholars were aware that many of the mummies they were purchasing were fakes, but continued to prescribe and consume them anyway. The psychological and cultural factors that allowed educated people to engage in cannibalism under the guise of medicine reveal disturbing aspects of European attitudes toward death, the human body, and other cultures. The industrial uses of mummies during this period are particularly horrifying. In addition to being ground up for medicine, mummies were used as fuel for locomotives, with their resin-soaked wrappings providing excellent kindling. The textile industry used mummy wrappings to make paper, while artists ground up mummy pigments to create a rich brown paint known as mummy brown. The casual destruction of irreplaceable archaeological artifacts for such mundane purposes represents one of the most shameful chapters in the history of Egyptology. The most shocking aspect of Victorian mummy mania was the complete disregard for the human dignity of the deceased. Mummies were treated as curiosities and entertainment, rather than as the remains of real people who had lived complex lives thousands of years ago. This callous attitude reflected broader Victorian assumptions about European superiority and the right to exploit the cultural heritage of other civilizations. The scientific study of mummies has revealed shocking truths about ancient Egyptian society that challenge many of our assumptions about this civilization. Advanced imaging techniques have shown that many mummies suffered from severe medical conditions that would have caused constant pain and disability. These findings suggest that life in ancient Egypt was often harsh and difficult, even for the elite classes who could afford elaborate burial preparations. DNA analysis of mummies has revealed shocking information about ancient Egyptian genetics and family relationships. Studies of royal mummies have confirmed extensive inbreeding among the pharaonic dynasties, resulting in genetic disorders that may have contributed to the eventual decline of Egyptian civilization. The genetic evidence also suggests that the ancient Egyptian population was more diverse than previously thought, with significant African, Middle Eastern, and Mediterranean influences. Isotopic analysis of mummy tissues has revealed shocking details about ancient Egyptian diet and lifestyle. Many mummies show evidence of severe nutritional deficiencies, even among the wealthy classes. This suggests that the ancient Egyptian diet, while rich in grains and vegetables, was often lacking in essential nutrients. The evidence also indicates that many Egyptians suffered from chronic parasitic infections caused by poor sanitation and contaminated water sources. The preservation of soft tissues in some mummies has allowed researchers to study ancient Egyptian diseases in unprecedented detail. These studies have revealed that many conditions we think of as modern problems, including heart disease, cancer, and diabetes, were actually common in ancient Egypt. Some mummies show evidence of successful surgical procedures, including brain surgery and limb amputations, suggesting that ancient Egyptian medicine was more advanced than previously believed. Recent archaeological discoveries continue to reveal new shocking truths about Egyptian mummification practices. In 2019, researchers discovered a cache of mummies that had been mummified while still wearing their jewelry and clothing. This discovery challenged previous assumptions about mummification procedures and suggested that some embalmers took shortcuts that compromised the preservation process. But perhaps the most shocking discovery from modern mummy research is the evidence of widespread violence in ancient Egyptian society. Many mummies show signs of traumatic injuries, including skull fractures, stab wounds, and arrow injuries. Some of these wounds appear to have been inflicted after death, suggesting that mutilation of corpses may have been practiced as a form of punishment or revenge. The mummy of Sekhemretar, a pharaoh from the Second Intermediate Period, provides shocking evidence of royal violence. His mummy shows multiple traumatic head injuries that appear to have been inflicted by different types of weapons, including axes, spears, and daggers. The severity and number of these wounds suggest that the pharaoh was brutally murdered, possibly in a palace coup, or during a battle with foreign invaders. Excavations at several royal burial sites have uncovered evidence of retainer sacrifice, where servants, guards, and even family members were killed and mummified to accompany pharaohs into the afterlife. These victims were often buried in positions that suggest they were killed specifically for this purpose, rather than dying natural deaths and being included in royal burials. The mummification of these sacrificial victims was typically much cruder than that of the pharaohs they served, suggesting that their preservation was an afterthought rather than a priority. The dark side of Egyptian mummification extends beyond individual practices to encompass broader social and religious implications that continue to shock researchers today. One of the most disturbing aspects that has emerged from recent studies is the evidence of human sacrifice associated with royal burials. While the Egyptians are not typically associated with human sacrifice, like some other ancient civilizations, mounting archaeological evidence suggests that the practice was more common than previously believed, particularly during times of political instability or religious transformation. The study of these recently discovered mummies has revealed evidence of a practice known as social mummification, where entire families or communities were mummified together, possibly during times of plague or famine. The poor quality of these mummifications suggests that they were performed quickly and cheaply, possibly by inexperienced embalmers or during times of social upheaval. The religious justification for these practices reveals another shocking aspect of ancient Egyptian spirituality. Unlike the carefully codified religious practices that governed royal mummification, human sacrifice appears to have been justified through more primitive beliefs about the need to provide the deceased pharaoh with a complete court in the afterlife. This suggests that beneath the sophisticated theological framework of ancient Egyptian religion lay much older and more brutal practices that persisted despite the civilization's advancement in other areas. The treatment of children in ancient Egyptian mummification practices provides some of the most disturbing evidence uncovered by modern archaeology. Child mummies are relatively rare compared to adult remains, partly because infant mortality was extremely high in ancient Egypt, and many families could not afford mummification for children who died young. However, when children were mummified, the process often revealed shocking attitudes toward young people in ancient Egyptian society. The practice of retainer sacrifice appears to have been most common during the early dynastic period, and times of political crisis, when pharaohs may have felt the need to demonstrate their power through spectacular burial displays. Some sites have yielded dozens of subsidiary burials around royal tombs, with evidence suggesting that these individuals were killed by strangulation, poison, or blunt force trauma shortly before or after the pharaoh's death. The study of child mummies has also revealed shocking information about childhood diseases and medical practices in ancient Egypt. Many child mummies show evidence of severe malnutrition, parasitic infections, and genetic disorders that would have caused constant suffering. Some show signs of primitive surgical procedures, including trepanation and limb amputations, suggesting that ancient Egyptian physicians were willing to perform dangerous operations on children despite the high risk of death. Archaeological evidence suggests that some children were deliberately killed for inclusion in adult burials, particularly in cases where royal women died in childbirth. These infant mummies show signs of having been mummified immediately after death, with no evidence of natural death or disease. The careful preservation of these children, alongside their mothers, suggests that their deaths were planned and ritualized rather than accidental. Even more disturbing is evidence that some children were mummified while still alive, possibly as part of religious rituals or as punishment for crimes committed by their families. These cases are extremely rare, and the evidence is still being debated by scholars, but the possibility that live mummification was practiced on children represents one of the most horrifying aspects of ancient Egyptian culture yet discovered. The scale of this trade was staggering. Historical records suggest that thousands of mummies were exported from Egypt during the medieval and early modern periods, representing a systematic destruction of the country's archaeological heritage. Entire cemeteries were excavated, and their contents sold to foreign merchants, with no regard for the historical or cultural value of these remains. The international mummy trade also led to the development of sophisticated forgery operations. Egyptian merchants learned to create convincing fake mummies using recently deceased individuals, animals, or even plant materials wrapped in aged linen and treated with bitumen and other preservatives. These forgeries were often indistinguishable from genuine ancient mummies and were sold at enormous profits to unsuspecting foreign buyers. The economic exploitation of mummification extended far beyond the practices of ancient embalmers to encompass a vast international trade that persisted well into the modern era. During the Islamic period in Egypt, Mummy trading became a major export industry, with preserved bodies being shipped throughout the Mediterranean and eventually to European markets. This trade was driven not by religious or cultural factors, but by the belief that mummy remains possessed magical and medicinal properties. The corruption associated with the mummy trade extended to the highest levels of Egyptian society. Government officials, religious leaders, and even members of the ruling class were involved in the systematic looting and export of mummified remains. This institutional corruption meant that Egypt's archaeological heritage was being destroyed with the full knowledge and participation of those who should have been protecting it. The industrial uses of mummies during the 19th and early 20th centuries represent perhaps the most shocking chapter in the long history of Egyptian mummification. As demand for mummy-based products continued to grow in Europe and America, Egyptian suppliers began to treat mummified remains as a raw material rather than as archaeological artifacts or human remains. Mummies were processed in industrial facilities where they were ground into powder, melted down for their resin content, or stripped of their wrappings for use in paper manufacturing. The scale of this destruction was enormous, with some facilities processing hundreds of mummies per month during peak periods. The casual treatment of human remains as industrial feedstock represents a level of dehumanization that is difficult to comprehend by modern standards. The textile industry made extensive use of mummy wrappings, which were considered superior to other materials for paper production due to their age and durability. Entire paper mills were dedicated to processing mummy wrappings, and the resulting paper was used for everything from newspapers to banknotes. The irony that some of the most important documents of the Victorian era may have been printed on paper, made from ancient Egyptian burial shrouds, adds a macabre dimension to this industrial exploitation. The railway industry's use of mummies as fuel represents perhaps the most callous example of this industrial exploitation. The resin-soaked wrappings of mummies burned well and were readily available in large quantities, making them an economical fuel source for locomotives operating in Egypt. The image of ancient pharaohs and nobles being shoveled into locomotive fireboxes as fuel provides a stark symbol of how completely the cultural and human value of these remains had been ignored in favor of commercial considerations. The paint industry's use of mummy pigments represents another shocking example of the commodification of human remains. Mummy brown, a rich pigment made from ground mummy remains, was prized by artists for its unique color and texture. Famous painters including Eugene Delacroix and Lawrence Armour Tadema used mummy brown in their works, meaning that fragments of ancient Egyptian people became literally incorporated into some of the most celebrated artworks of the 19th century. The social implications of mummy medicine were equally disturbing. The consumption of human remains was justified through racist and Orientalist attitudes that portrayed ancient Egyptians as fundamentally different from modern Europeans. This dehumanization made it psychologically easier for Western consumers to engage in practices that would have been considered abhorrent if applied to European remains. The medical profession's embrace of mummy-based treatments represents another shocking aspect of this exploitation. European and American physicians continued to prescribe ground mummy powder well into the 20th century, despite growing evidence that these treatments were not only ineffective, but potentially dangerous. The persistence of cannibalistic medical practices in supposedly advanced societies reveals disturbing aspects of medical culture that prioritize tradition and superstition over scientific evidence. Recent archaeological discoveries continue to reveal new shocking truths about ancient Egyptian mummification practices. Advanced ground-penetrating radar and satellite imaging have identified thousands of previously unknown burial sites throughout Egypt, many of which contain evidence of mass mummification on a scale previously unimagined. These sites suggest that mummification was practiced much more widely than previously believed, and that entire communities may have been preserved during times of crisis or epidemic. The DNA analysis of these recently discovered mummies has revealed shocking information about population movements and cultural exchange in ancient Egypt. Many mummies contain genetic markers that suggest significant migration and intermarriage between Egyptian and foreign populations, challenging traditional notions of ancient Egyptian ethnic identity. Some mummies show evidence of diseases that were previously unknown in ancient Egypt, suggesting that increased trade and contact with other civilizations brought new health challenges to the population. Perhaps most shocking of all are the discoveries that suggest some form of mummification may have continued in Egypt well into the Islamic period, centuries after the practice was supposedly abandoned. Hidden burial chambers have been found containing mummies that date to the medieval period, preserved using techniques that combine traditional Egyptian methods with Islamic burial practices. These discoveries challenge our understanding of the continuity of ancient Egyptian culture and suggest that mummification practices may have survived in secret long after the official conversion to Islam. The study of these newly discovered sites has revealed evidence of experimental mummification techniques that were apparently used when traditional methods were unavailable or impractical. Some sites contain mummies that were preserved using salt from the Mediterranean rather than natron from the desert, while others show evidence of preservation techniques borrowed from other cultures. These variations suggest that Egyptian embalmers were more innovative and adaptable than previously believed. The study of mummy preservation techniques has also revealed shocking information about ancient Egyptian knowledge of chemistry and medicine. Analysis of the resins and preservatives used in mummification shows that Egyptian embalmers had sophisticated understanding of antimicrobial agents and chemical preservation processes. Some of the compounds they used were not rediscovered by modern science until the 20th century, suggesting that ancient Egyptian chemistry was far more advanced than previously believed. The discovery of budget mummification workshops has revealed that some embalmers specialized in providing cheap preservation services to the middle classes. These workshops used assembly line techniques and inferior materials to process large numbers of bodies quickly and cheaply. The resulting mummies were often poorly preserved and would begin decomposing within years of burial, but they provided at least the appearance of proper mummification for families who could not afford high-quality treatment. The social stratification revealed through mummification practices continues to shock researchers with its extremity and institutionalization. Recent studies have shown that the differences in mummification quality between social classes were even greater than previously understood. While elite mummies received elaborate treatment with imported resins and precious materials, lower-class mummies were often preserved using local materials that were barely effective at preventing decomposition. The religious exploitation associated with mummification represents another shocking aspect of ancient Egyptian society. Evidence suggests that some priests and religious officials used the promise of proper afterlife preparation to extort money and property from grieving families. The complex religious requirements associated with mummification created opportunities for corruption, as families depended on religious authorities to ensure that their deceased relatives would successfully navigate the afterlife. Even more shocking is the evidence that some families went into debt or sold property to pay for mummification services, viewing proper preservation as essential for their relatives' afterlife prospects. This created a cycle of economic exploitation, where embalmers could charge enormous fees for services that many families could not actually afford. Some families apparently mortgaged their homes or sold their land to pay for mummification, leaving surviving family members in poverty. Archaeological evidence indicates that some temples operated their own mummification facilities and required worshippers to use these services rather than independent embalmers. This created religious monopolies that could charge premium prices while providing inferior services. The concentration of mummification in religious institutions also meant that priests had enormous power over families' spiritual and economic well-being. The study of mummification tools and facilities has revealed shocking details about the working conditions and social status of embalmers themselves. Embalmers' workshops were typically located downwind from populated areas due to the terrible smells associated with their work. The embalmers themselves were often social outcasts who lived in poverty despite the essential nature of their services to Egyptian society. Evidence suggests that many embalmers suffered from serious health problems related to their exposure to toxic preservative chemicals and decomposing organic matter. Analysis of embalmer burials shows higher rates of respiratory disease, skin conditions, and premature death compared to other occupational groups. The irony that the people responsible for preserving others for eternity often died young from occupational hazards adds a tragic dimension to the mummification industry. The apprenticeship system for embalmers appears to have been particularly harsh, with young people being exposed to dangerous chemicals and traumatic procedures from an early age. Some evidence suggests that embalmer families were essentially trapped in their profession, as the social stigma associated with their work made it difficult for them to pursue other occupations or marry outside their professional community. The international legal and ethical issues surrounding Egyptian mummies continue to create shocking revelations about cultural appropriation and human rights violations. Many of the mummies currently displayed in museums around the world were acquired through questionable means during the colonial period, when Egypt had little control over the export of its archaeological heritage. The continued display of human remains without the consent of the individuals or their cultural descendants raises serious ethical questions that the museum community is only beginning to address. Recent calls for the repatriation of Egyptian mummies have highlighted the extent to which Western institutions have profited from the display of other cultures' human remains. Some museums have spent enormous sums acquiring and displaying mummy collections, while contributing little to the preservation of Egypt's remaining archaeological sites. This imbalance represents a continuation of the colonial exploitation that has characterized Western interaction with Egyptian cultural heritage for centuries. The commercial exploitation of mummy imagery and cultural symbols in modern popular culture represents another form of appropriation that trivializes the religious and cultural significance of ancient Egyptian burial practices. The use of mummy themes in horror movies, Halloween costumes, and tourist attractions reduces a sophisticated spiritual tradition to mere entertainment, perpetuating stereotypes and misconceptions about ancient Egyptian culture. As we reach the conclusion of our exploration into the shocking truths about ancient Egyptian mummies, it becomes clear that the reality of mummification was far more complex, disturbing, and morally ambiguous than the sanitized versions presented in popular culture and museum displays. The practices we've examined tonight reveal a civilization that was simultaneously sophisticated and brutal, deeply spiritual and ruthlessly commercial, innovative and exploitative. The legacy of Egyptian mummification extends far beyond the preserved bodies themselves, to encompass centuries of exploitation, commercialization, and cultural appropriation that continue to this day. The shocking truths we've uncovered about ancient Egyptian mummification practices serve as a reminder that even the most celebrated achievements of past civilizations often came at enormous human cost and were shaped by social inequalities and moral compromises that we would find unacceptable today. Perhaps the most important lesson from our journey tonight is the need to approach ancient cultures with both appreciation for their achievements and honest acknowledgement of their failings. The ancient Egyptians created one of the most remarkable civilizations in human history, but they were also capable of cruelty, exploitation, and dehumanization on a scale that shocks modern sensibilities. By understanding both the light and dark aspects of their culture, we can develop a more complete and honest appreciation for the complexity of human civilization itself. As you drift off to sleep tonight, may you carry with you not just the shocking revelations we've shared, but also a deeper appreciation for the importance of treating all human remains and cultural heritage with the dignity and respect they deserve. The mummies of ancient Egypt were once living, breathing people with hopes, fears, dreams, and relationships just like our own. Their preservation across thousands of years provides us with an extraordinary window into the past, but it also carries with it a responsibility to honor their memory and learn from both the achievements and failures of their civilization. The story of Egyptian mummification is ultimately a human story, one that reveals both the heights of achievement and the depths of exploitation that our species is capable of reaching. As we continue to uncover new evidence and develop new technologies for studying the past, we must remember that behind every mummy is an individual human being whose life and death deserve our respect, regardless of how many centuries have passed since they walked the earth. Sweet dreams, and may your rest be peaceful as you contemplate the eternal sleep of the ancient Egyptians who, through their preservation, continue to teach us about the complexities of life, death, and human nature itself.